All the action today coming in from Tokyo and actually across the Sea of Japan. So we'll get to what was discussed in Quad. And this was an important Quad meet in the backdrop, second Quad meet in the backdrop of so many important geopolitical events. The Ukraine-Russia war is still on. The world is facing inflation and possibly food shortages. But meanwhile, look at what happened on the sidelines, in a sense. It's being considered an act of aggression. Chinese H-6K bombers and Russian Tu-95MS bombers conducted joint sorties above the Sea of Japan, even as Quad leaders were sitting in Tokyo. Those were some pictures that came out today, put out by state-affiliated Chinese media. The Russian Defense Ministry claims that these are regular joint exercises, but the Japanese have a very different point of view. They see this as a form of aggression. Let me first go across to my colleague Madhav, who joins us from Tokyo with all the details.
A very sensational allegation coming in from Japan as far as the China-Russia joint exercises are concerned. Japan, in fact, coming out to say that while the Quad summit was out, when Prime Minister Modi, US President Joe Biden and the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese were engaged in the Quad along with the Japanese Prime Minister that was being held at the Prime Minister's office here in Tokyo, there was a joint exercise being carried out by China and Russia in the northeastern part of Asia. And this aircraft carrier actually had fighter jets which were also flown at that point of time in a location that perhaps is not very far from Japan. Is this a clear positioning? Is this some kind of a messaging that China and Russia are now resorting to? Is a question that certainly comes to mind in the wake of these reports that have been widely now reported in the international media. The Chinese mouthpiece Global Times has of course put out a denial saying that it was a routine exercise, but the timing of this entire exercise really can only lead to the speculation that over the recent days, the kind of statements, the kind of rhetoric on Taiwan, with President Biden coming out to say that if required, the US would militarily defend Taiwan, and the kind of sharp rhetoric with China that we've seen over the last few days has perhaps provoked this kind of a warning, because we know that the statement that has been issued as well as far as the Quad meeting is concerned refers to China and Russia obliquely, while not taking the name, referring to a lot of acts that are objecting to, and the four Quad nations also coming together on multiple aspects of the problems with Chinese expansionism. In fact, I was at the Prime Minister's office when this meeting was being carried out, and we did see helicopter sorties taking place continuously through the course of the entire Quad meeting. So clearly over there was some kind of a threat or some kind of a feeling within the Japanese defense establishment that these kind of exercises are being carried out.
So that was Madhav reporting from Tokyo. But let's take a look at what happened actually in the Quad. And that's why I said sometimes the Quad is about not the elephant, but the dragon in the room. The purpose of the Quad, which includes four nations, Australia, the United States, Japan and India, is to maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Global health security is also very much on the agenda, so is climate change. So the joint statement today issued by these four leaders dealt with many of these major issues that have global ramifications. The Quad group of countries also wants to address climate change and make robust arrangements for cybersecurity while harnessing critical and emerging technologies to ensure prosperity. Another key point was an investment of $50 billion to develop infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region. But what will surely not go unnoticed is the emphasis on peaceful resolution of disputes and the freedom of navigation in East and South China Seas. China was not mentioned by name, but it's clear that the four countries are now consolidating their ties to challenge China's unilateral and provocative actions. Listen in to what Prime Minister Modi and US President Joe Biden said today.
इतने कम समय में क्वाड समूह ने विश्व पटल पर एक महत्वपूर्ण स्थान बना लिया है। आज क्वाड का स्कोप व्यापक हो गया है और स्वरूप प्रभावी हो गया है। हमारा आपसी विश्वास, हमारा डिटर्मिनेशन लोकतांत्रिक शक्तियों को नई ऊर्जा और उत्साह दे रहा है। क्वाड के स्तर पर हमारे आपसी सहयोग से एक फ्री, ओपन और इंक्लूसिव इंडो पैसिफिक क्षेत्र को प्रोत्साहन मिल रहा है। जो हम सभी का साझा उद्देश्य है। कोविड-19 की विपरीत परिस्थितियों के बावजूद हमने वैक्सीन डिलीवरी, क्लाइमेट एक्शन, सप्लाई चेन रेजिलियंस, डिजास्टर रिस्पांस और आर्थिक सहयोग जैसे कई क्षेत्रों में आपसी समन्वय बढ़ाया है। इससे इंडो पैसिफिक में शांति, समृद्धि और स्थिरता सुनिश्चित हो रही है। क्वाड इंडो पैसिफिक क्षेत्र के लिए एक कंस्ट्रक्टिव एजेंडा लेकर चल रहा है। इससे क्वाड की छवि एक फोर्स फॉर गुड के रूप में और भी सुदृढ़ होती जाएगी।
We also discussed the ongoing effects of Russia's brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine and the effect it has on the entire global world order. And the U.S. and India are going to continue consulting closely on how to mitigate these negative effects. I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation today. Mr. Prime Minister, there's so much that our countries can and will do together, and I'm committed to making U.S.-India partnership among the closest we have on earth.
And to speak more on this, I'm joined now by Ambassador Leela K Ponappa, former career diplomat and former Deputy NSA, Nalin Surie, former High Commissioner to UK and former Ambassador to China and Poland, joining us on the show this evening. Mukesh, Aghi, CEO and President at USISPF, also speaking with us this evening. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us on the India Development Debate. Ambassador Surie, let me begin with your take, and I want to address this business of sorties between Russia and China on the sidelines and during actually the timing of while that Quad meet was on, Japan's interpretation of it. How do you see this? Would it be correct to look at this as direct aggressive reaction to the Quad meet?
I wouldn't call it a direct aggressive reaction, but I think my answer is going to be a little complicated. You know, it would have been very difficult for the Chinese not to react in some manner after Mr. Biden made the statement that he did on Taiwan. So several messages are being conveyed through this joint sorties. One is that Russia and China still stand together in spite of what's happening in Ukraine and all the pressure on Russia by the West and the other countries. The second is that the Chinese are showing that, look, we will defend our national interests to the extent that we think is necessary. And if that means making a show of strength before a summit by 4 countries, which they believe are in the process of wanting to encircle them or to whittle their power down, then I think they will do so. What worries me, and actually doesn't worry me, what interests me is why the Chinese are so rattled. The rattling is not because of the Taiwan issue. The rattling is because Quad is beginning to gain momentum. The decisions of this summit, to my mind, are significant. It was a successful outing by the 4 Quad heads, and Quad is gaining traction. China has been trying since the beginning of this century, which virtually, or not this century, I beg your pardon, since about 2015, after Mr. Obama first made that Pacific Ocean statement in Delhi, that, you know, this process of getting the Quad or the Indo-Pacific should be prevented from happening. So they are now definitely rattled. That's good. There's no doubt about that. And the kind of decisions which you also referred to that have been taken at the Quad summit are very significant, including the ones on cybersecurity and critical and emerging technologies and maritime domain awareness. So I think this messaging this time is loud and clear that we are no longer going to sit back and keep talking about things, but that we are going to start doing things. And I think the proof of the pudding will be in the implementation of all these initiatives that have been announced.
Ambassador Ponappa, I want to stress once again on the China question, because the official stance from Moscow has been that these are regular sorties, and Japan has this history of issues with these exercises that China and Russia conducts near its borders. So how do you look at the context of the timing? Can you say that these are related?
Well, obviously they are. And I think this is China's way of responding to the ambience that has been created in this part of Asia, and as typified now by the actual meeting of the Quad summit leaders. So it's a kind of response that, on the one hand, you have people ask, is the Quad anti-China? You could say that since China is never mentioned, it's really a question of laying down certain principles by which these countries claim they will function in this part of Asia. A consequence of that is that China feels that it is being targeted. And I think the method in which the Quad progresses, and you see that they talk about, the joint statement is a very substantive statement, by the way. Typically you have a lot of good words coming out of such summits. But if you take a look at the details of the statement, whether it's with regard to the COVID, whether it's regard to supply chains, whether it's regard to cybersecurity, it's all quite substantive, also in terms of follow-up of what was decided at earlier summits. So China is feeling the pushback, as it were, to its attempt at creating itself as a hegemon in terms of East Asia in particular, and really through the BRI in other parts of the world. And this is something that, as Ambassador Surie just pointed out, they are feeling rattled. But I think it is China's own behavior that has, in effect, created this kind of a response. So it is work in progress. There are shifting blocks going around, and we'll have to try to see where, if at all, there is equilibrium. It will take time.
Yeah. Mr. Aghi, in the context of this particular Quad meet, what to your mind were the key takeaways and the differentiators? The question about Quad in recent times has been that not all four are on the same page vis-a-vis the sharpness of condemnation, at least as far as Russia goes. India has its own stance and nuanced position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that those differences are now behind us as far as the Quad is concerned? Is that one of the takeaways that would be correct in your view from the joint statement?
Well, let me respond to the first part and the second part. The first part is, for the first time, we are seeing US and India together on one side, and China and Russia being rattled and coming in at sorties to send a message. It's very clear, while the Quad seems to be a formation to deal with China, to drag in Russia sends a message that Russia is a junior partner in this. And if there is a stress point between India and China, Russia position could go in the favor of partnering with China itself. To me, that's a very clear messaging which came out on the sorties which flew this morning on the Sea of Japan. As far as India's position goes on Russia and Ukraine, I think there is a maturity of the relationship. There is an acceptance of the position, which is different, because at the end of the day, India has conveyed it has to protect its interests, just like US does, or Australia does, or Japan. So I think that has been accepted. Where we have to work hard is, while the administration in the US is aligned with India's position, the empathy for Ukraine in the United States is very high. And we see that in the Congress, and we have to work the Congress to make sure they understand India's position much more clearly. But overall, the messages we get is that Biden administration works with India on its position with Russia. And finally, when we look at on the outcome of the Quad, you have to understand the Indo-Pacific economic formation is a win-win, especially for India, because it does not bring rigidness of a trade pact. It brings flexibility. It brings option for India to look at the 4 pillars which have been announced, pick and choose and run with it, and be a partner in the economic development of the Asia-Pacific region. So I see this as a success story for India. It's a success story for Quad itself, and we will see more and more economic cooperation development taking place in the region itself.
IPF is actually a very important point which we should touch upon as well. Ambassador Surie, in terms of India's role and growing prominence in the Quad, where do you see that going? Is India, in a sense, setting the stage of how this grouping can move forward in a more cohesive fashion? I mean, what does the Quad really stand for? that's been a bit ambiguous so far, isn't it?
I think the ambiguity is no longer there. I think the document this time, as Ambassador Ponappa also mentioned, is a very substantive document and should be read with great care. Of course, the implementation of the agreements is where the problem always comes in. But I think the Quad has now assumed a traction which, if it's handled properly, can only go upwards. And in that process, it will help in the evolution of the architectures that are being drawn up for the Indo-Pacific, or at least are being attempted to make the entire Indo-Pacific as distinct from the Asia-Pacific. As you know, the Chinese are only interested in the Asia-Pacific. Our interest in the Indo-Pacific, our natural extended hinterland goes all the way from East Africa to across the Western Pacific. So I think we have to understand that, and I think our position has now been well understood, whether it's on Ukraine or on the geographical expanse of the Indo-Pacific. Although there are still very strong elements which would like to focus on the Asia-Pacific. And that is why the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum becomes important. Because you are now going out of the RCEP, the APEC kind of formulations, and you're going into a broader Indo-Pacific economic framework. And I think that is very important. It's very young. It's in the process of conception, as is clear from the documents itself.
Sure.
But I think the 4 areas that have been listed are critical for all the region going forward. I think they are worth recalling. It's trade, especially digital trade. It's supply chains and various aspects of supply chains. It's clean energy, it's clean shipping, green shipping, and it's taxation and corruption. So I think, if we look at the possible evolution of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, it can act as a very critical supplement to the Quad and thereby to the Indo-Pacific as a whole. And so I think we should work, and I'm happy that we have signed on at the very beginning and not waited to join late. I think that is an important decision that the government took. And I think we now have to make sure that we play our role in the negotiation processes in all these areas which are of critical importance to us. So I think the IPF has a future going ahead, but we have to make it happen.
Ambassador Ponappa, coming back to the China question, and both of you all have addressed to some extent on the fact that China is clearly rattled. I'm wondering, in actual terms, is the Quad truly a threat of that nature to China? There's no clarity on whether this will be a formation which can be used for security purposes. It is supposed to be for maintenance of peace in the Indo-Pacific region. So I want you to flesh out that context about why it's being seen as a possible threat by China.
Tamanna, I believe on your channel, perhaps last year when that first summit in-person summit in Washington took place, I do believe I said that at this stage, it isn't, Quad itself is trying to develop its identity, and it's not quite clear whether it is fish or fowl. I think the progression that has taken place since then in identifying not military aspects of cooperation, although that also exists, particularly in the maritime domain. I think it is in the context of the economic, the critical technology part of it, and really the development of sustainable supply chains. It's not just a China thing. It started out during the COVID time. I think all global industry today is suffering from a desperate shortage of semiconductors and chips. And I think suddenly the world has woken up, as it did at one stage to the rise of China. And I would really say the rise of China as a major supplier to the world in all areas. I do believe the international community has recognized that whatever the so-called apparent economic benefits of China's pricing and so on are concerned, it is incumbent that countries develop alternatives. And I think in a way, the Quad is an attempt to develop this type of alternative in close consultation with ASEAN, the centrality of which has been very strongly reaffirmed in the joint statement. So this is, on the one hand, what's happening in Europe is really the upturning of the post-World War II security equilibrium and the architecture that was very painstakingly developed over the years through the OSCE and so on and so forth. here the architecture also is evolving. And the question is, how will it take shape? China is trying to develop a whole set of alternate institutions to take over the global institutions that currently exist. And you have 4 like-minded countries with differences, mind you. Again, you take a look at the joint statement on Ukraine. It's very interesting that they talk about the respective responses to the tragic war in Ukraine. So I think differences are accepted. And perhaps this is what the Prime Minister meant when he used the term flexible, which was the first time I heard it in the context of this grouping. So these really, I think, are the opportunities of these countries trying to develop the strengths in critical areas.
Right.
Not just with the military area, but in the technological, the scientific, the cyber area.
So, Mr. Aghi, let me come to you with the big question. Can these groupings, or even the IPEF in that sense, be a substantive alternative to China? China got beaten down during COVID-19 in its status as a manufacturer to the world. A lot of nations started looking for alternatives, and its position on Russia has underscored that. But who else really has that prowess and capability? That question still remains unanswered, doesn't it?
Well, we should not say that it is an alternative to China. I think Quad is for India is about national security, economic security, energy security. It's about trade. It's about job creation. And I think keeping that in mind, and Prime Minister agenda of having a $5 to $10 trillion economy, the Quad plays a very pivotal role in the economic development of India, on the improving the quality of life of India. Let's look at from every aspect. Today in the boardroom in the US, they're discussing China plus one strategy. While Shanghai is locked down, other part of China is locked down, the supply chain has been impacted. That's having an inflationary effect on the consumers around the world itself. So countries and companies are saying we need alternative supply chain. And I think that's where India can play a very, very pivotal role. And I've mentioned this earlier, 40% of the US generic drugs today comes from India, but 70% of the API of those drugs come from China into India itself. We need to secure that, because what happens is that 40% of the generic drugs provides hundreds of billions of dollars saving to US consumers itself. We look at semiconductor supply chain. The auto industry is suffering from that. We look at every aspect on the supply chain that has been impacted. And one more thing I have to leave you in mind is, for the first time, we saw a US corporation got weaponized in Russia. And suddenly, American companies had to move out, not by a diktat, but by the consumer sentiment. The question, the boardroom in America today is, what happens if China invades Taiwan? What happened to the investments in China itself? So people are looking at alternative, and India provides that alternative to these companies.
You know, it's going to be an interesting story to watch, but there has been a clear display of nervousness with these sorties that took place during the Quad meet. And this has been displayed clearly by China and Russia, that this grouping is worrying them. Why is China so rattled? That remains a big question. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on this lead debate. I'm going to